Good afternoon and welcome to How Do the Arts Build Community, a programme as part of NHTP's NH Gives 2020 campaign. I'm Catherine Stewart, the Artistic Director of New Hampshire Theatre Project, and I'm joined by Janice Hastings, our Marketing Director, and Genevieve Aichele, our Founding Executive Director. Today is a casual conversation about the work that we do and how that relates to community. We're thinking a lot about that right now and a lot about how that will change in the future. So Jen, maybe let's start by exploring if we're thinking about how our work partners with community and interacts with community and impacts community. First of all, let's think about who we are. What is New Hampshire Theatre Project?
Well, that's a great question. And I've been asked that question for over 30 years because we're really an interesting model. I mean, we're not like any other theater company, at least in this state. And I think there actually aren't too many models like this even in the US. I mean, I'm going to defer to you, Catherine, because you're from the UK and European countries. There's more of a three-tiered system of theater. So professional theater is, unions, and then amateur theater is amateurs, and there's a great AmDram. I love that British term. There are so many amazing amateur theaters over in the UK. But then there's something called community theater, which is community. A theater that's based in a community, and it's professionally trained actors who are dedicated to working in the community, in applied theater and docudrama and playback theater and arts and education. And that's really what New Hampshire Theatre Project is. And but it's difficult because if we say we're community theater, people think, oh, you're an amateur theater who just puts on plays. But we are so much more than that. And yet we're not a fully professional equity theater, although we do have some of our artists are members of the union. And we do produce plays, but we don't only do that. We do a lot of other things as well. So, that idea of community, I wish there was another word, but the English language, sometimes it's just not enough to express everything. The word community means so many different things to so many different people. But really, I believe we are, in essence, a community theater. I don't know if you all agree with that or not.
I do. And how many times have I gone to the thesaurus when writing to figure out, is there another word for community? It's so overused. And I feel like there is a reason it's overused because I can't think of another way to say it.
Yeah.
Community involves all people. It's inclusive of all people. And that's the piece that we strive for, or one of the pieces that we strive for.
Yeah, and I like to think a lot about the communities that are formed when we do the work that we do. So we might be making a piece of theatre in service to a particular community. Most predominantly, we're making it with that community, but we might also not necessarily be part of that community ourselves, and then we're invited in. Or if it's a group of seemingly disparate individuals or organizations that come together to form its own new community as well. And yeah, I desperately want another word for that sometimes, because the word community doesn't always fully articulate the bonds that are created during an art making process, and for us specifically a theatre making process. But I guess it's the word that we have. This particular conversation is about how the arts build community, but I'm wondering if we also want to talk a little bit about our processes specifically of theatre making as the art form that we use to do that, and how we've done that over the years, Genevieve, and what we kind of focus on. What programs do we focus on now that really aim to build community?
Well, you know, sometimes people say, well, why is your name New Hampshire Theater Project or project, as Catherine says? And right from the very beginning, we wanted to be about two things. One was we're a company that does theater. That's our art form. And also we do different projects within the community. Sometimes those projects are a production and the community is our group of artists. Sometimes, like, I'll use the Crucible as an example. So we had professional artists that were part of NHTP's company. We had community artists, and we had our youth, what do you call it? The apprentice company. We had a lot of youth performers in that. And I purposely chose the Crucible, not only because of its provocative and very apt implications for our time, but because it could use a broad spectrum of performers. And so within that piece, we built one community. And then when audience members came, you know, I staged it in the round because I wanted people to really feel like they were there participating. That built another community. So that's always been the process that we follow. When we first started, we were primarily educational. We toured to schools and we did a lot of artist in residence programs. We also did a lot through the Rural Arts Program, which was through the Hampshire State Council on the Arts. And that was taking theater into places in New Hampshire, way north country, that didn't have any exposure at all. And we performed in libraries and town halls and schools.
Therapeutic residentials for
A lot of that.
At-risk youth.
Yeah.
That's
and
where
at
we
some
met.
point, Janice, you should talk about your background, you know, and how we met, because Janice and I both worked for what was then called Very Special Arts, working with, to include.
Actually, it was before that even, because I was working at Odyssey House.
Right.
And that was a therapeutic residential for teens. We, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a study that came out about at-risk youth. That was the term in those, you know, we've outgrown that. But the notion was that through Artist in Residence, we had no arts programming. There was an on-site education certified school, and it was only through Artist in Residence programs that we were able to bring the arts to students. And it was there that were you Kitchen Sink or New Hampshire Theater Project? I can't remember.
Well, I don't know, because it morphed, you know.
I can't remember.
When we first started, we were called Kitchen Sink Productions, but that wasn't for very long.
Right.
4 years later, we incorporated as New Hampshire Theater Project.
Right. And it was a residency. Remember, we had the students write vignettes, and then we staged them and performed them at a church next door. And it was fascinating for the process of that, and to watch those kids whose voices had really not been heard find a voice, you know, in that moment, and then be able to translate that experience either into their therapy or into the classroom, and eventually, you know, into their work to kind of re-enter and leave sort of graduate and leave the therapeutic community. It was an amazing process, and it was where I started my career, because I realized this is the work. I would sit in staff meetings sometimes, and it would be nothing but negative conversation, or not negative conversation, but it would be, we saw this behavior, this behavior, this behavior, and all those behaviors were negative. And I would be sitting thinking, okay, I might be the newbie here, but I saw nothing but great writing. And did you know that Sean is hilarious? Like, does anyone know that about this kid? And it would be those moments of self-discovery that translated. And it was really powerful, informative. And 30 years later, I'm still doing this work. And that's where we met, Jen. It was through an artist residency.
And my mother actually
That's
taught
right.
there. I don't remember if she was there then.
She was.
Yeah, she still hears from some of those young people who have gone on and actually become very successful in their lives. I found some of those old photos, which I would share with you.
Yeah.
I would love to see all those.
Yeah.
I probably remember the names of some of all those kids too. It's
Yeah.
just.
Yeah.
And
That
so
was how we got started, and that was just one example of
Yeah.
the many, many hundreds of communities we worked with.
right, and that makes me think, the word that really stuck out to me there that's resonating with me, Janice, from what you were saying is the word process. How the process is central to what we do, and it's exemplified in the work of the Crucible as well. Or I think when we see the programs that we run that have the most impact, we can see that they are not just a finished product. They are a process, and that they begin with strong foundations, and move through challenges, successes, and end with some kind of culminating event. As we think about how the arts build community, what do we think are important for those foundational pieces at the beginning of these processes? What do the partners coming together have to bring to the table? What does New Hampshire Theatre Project have to bring to the table when we start one of these processes, if we're doing it well?
Well, I think, and actually, Janice, I believe you have some information from our most recent meeting with the whole company, which was the board, artists, and advisors, and we might share that. But I think that there's several things that come. For me, one of the most important things is the dedication to process means a dedication to the craft. And that means excellence. And I always love to use Liz Lerman's example of horizontal art. I'm sure you know this very well, but she uses the example that we often think that cutting edge art, real art, happens up here with, very highly trained professionals. And, down here at the bottom of this line are beginners, volunteers, community members, students. But if we turn that line to be horizontal, cutting edge art, dance, theater can happen anywhere along that line. The difference between here and here is rigorous training, is discipline and dedication to the craft. So that's what we bring. We bring the artists who have that rigorous training, but the art that we create invites everyone into that process. And I was thinking about the word collaboration before we started this. Part of it was in the idea of conflict resolution. When we talk about how people handle conflict, there's 4 basic models. They either, some people like to avoid conflict altogether. Some want to, confront, which is what we do an awful lot of in social media right now. Others want to compromise, but that means that, nobody gets what they want, right? But the most effective way to handle conflict is collaboration. And that is creating something new and using the problem itself. And that's what theater does. We always, when you're training actors, you say, increase the stakes, heighten the tension, get the drama up there. We're looking for conflict, but where it goes and how it resolves is part of what makes great theater, but it also makes great community building.
It's interesting. The first word that popped into my head was respect. And one of the things that or a couple of things that we talked about at the last planning session came out of an examination of what is New Hampshire Theatre Project's impact. And there were 2 statements in particular that address this just completely. One is that theater as a process rather than an event is impact that we have. And the other is respect for the creative process, the craft, the artist, and the audience. And there's a sense when creating that everyone has a voice. They don't always necessarily perhaps know what that is at the beginning, and it's through a safe and I'm stuck on the word pure, that's not probably the right word, but through a well-guided and inclusive creative process, that there is a place for all voice, and there's that resolution happens together. You can't create without sharing something of yourself. And if people are not in a place where they feel safe enough and there's a solid process there, you don't get to the bottom of it.
That a word that just resonated with me is safe. And Catherine, that's one of the things that you do so beautifully as a facilitator, whether we're having a difficult conversation or as, you know, working as an actor when you're a director. You really create a safe place for people to do their art and to be vulnerable. And that would be great if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, your process and that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have been really fortunate recently to have opportunities to facilitate in lots of different environments, and I've been honored to have compliments on my process, or people kind of express those same resonances with them, that it has been safe and you're allowed to be vulnerable. Defining how that happens is really tricky sometimes. I'm not, you know, and but I am trying to think about that, because I think we want to ensure that each of the spaces that New Hampshire Theatre Project convenes in some way, or the spaces that it holds for the community, whether that's internally our artists or externally in larger projects, all of those spaces have to be safe. And I do really like the more recent term of brave spaces, because we can't always be sure whether a space is safe for everyone. But what we can ensure is what you were just saying there, Janice, in that respect is there, that we respect the perspectives of each individual in the room, and that each individual is an expert in their own perspective, and that they are not there to represent a group of people, the group of people that we perhaps think they fit with, the group of people that we presume they fit with. They're there only to speak from themselves. And I think part of the work I like to do is to ensure that we are all aware of that, and that we can speak from who we are, but we can't necessarily speak for someone else.
Right.
And I think about that a lot when we're dealing with the difficult conversations that inevitably come up in any of these processes, but particularly come up in Elephant in the Room. That is the purpose of that program, a program that bases in theatre as in its simplest form, as play readings, as simple presentations of conflict and tension that uncover something that we are afraid to see. And in the conversations that follow any of those presentations, the dialogues that are facilitated, everybody is allowed to speak, and they have to be an expert in their own experience. But we get into tricky waters when we try and represent something we are not, or that we don't understand, or that we think we understand, but we haven't really, you know. And that's where the word empathy also feels really tricky right now.
Yeah, top of my page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? What are you thinking about in terms of that word? Why is it top of your page?
Well, when we first talked about recording this conversation, I thought, you know, what is the greatest gift that theater gives to the world? And empathy just came immediately to my mind, because empathy is about putting yourself in someone else's shoes, in someone else's experience. And actors, the nature of the craft is that we have to understand someone. I was having a conversation with Peter Motson, who's on our advisory board and is also an equity actor. And we were talking about how difficult it is to play unlikable characters, or characters with whom we personally disagree. For him, it was when he had to play the perpetrator in a play about child abuse. And he said it was one of the most difficult things he'd ever done. And I was thinking about Janine and the Niceties, who was an extraordinary challenge for me personally. Sometimes I just wanted to smack her. But at the end of the process, I understood her. And then the other piece is that an audience member can watch a play or hear a reading and suddenly gain new understanding to why a person acts that way or does what they do. And then when we have a conversation about it, as we do with the elephant in the room, so we have, when we first started that, and it's become very important that a lot of the issues we talk about are issues with stigma. They're issues about which people have ideas or concepts that aren't necessarily true for the general, in the general sense. They might be true. You know, I had this one experience with an addict in my family, and therefore all addicts are that way. And so we're trying to undo some of that stigma by letting people tell their personal stories. And that is a process of creating empathy. If you can feel what another human being feels, then it's difficult to continue to judge that human being or to think of them as other than yourself.
Yeah.
There's a couple other words that came out. Transformation is one of them. And it's that process of discovery about others, self-discovery, where the two meet or don't, and being allowed the space to change, which can be really suspicious sometimes, right? Is that truthful? Is that real? Is that, you know, and I think that's another piece of it. It's one of our board members, I think it was at the last planning session, said that our work makes people think during and beyond the theater experience, that process can continue after the work is done, and does and should, perhaps.
Yeah, and is a successful program one that supports what happens, not just in the room, just during the process, but somewhat what even becomes what happens before the process, all the things that happen as we build towards it. And then there's some kind of longevity that is supported there as well. Because if the artist just arrives in a situation, does their work, no matter how respectful that space is, no matter how conscientious that space is and supportive, that if we just disappear again with no lasting support, and it's not saying that we ourselves have to be embedded for the rest of someone's life or the organization or another organization, but how do you support the next part, you know? Because I'm just thinking a lot about, like if we see a play where the character kind of changes too quickly, we don't believe it. We don't trust it. We don't enjoy it necessarily. I often think the most powerful plays, the best plays are the plays where, and this has been said before by many other people, where there could be another play after it, right? Like there's enough questions left, but the playwright chose to just focus on one area and not meander off into something else. Can we build programs that support the next play? And if we're really doing our job, we are empowering, we are, you know, supporting participants to take the next step as well. And so that transformation can continue.
Well, I think, you know, like with Elephant in the Room, you know, we work with a lot of different organizations. I mean, every time we present an Elephant in the Room program, it's not just us. There are, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 other social service organizations that have gathered together to help put this. They become a resource themselves. They carry on the next steps. And then we have the, you know, we call them action plans, but there are really a lot of resources for people continuing that process. We've talked about with that program how we could more formally do something, a second step. We haven't quite gotten there yet, I don't think. But, I was also thinking about building community. I was thinking of Max Feintalk, who's one of our board members, who she invites a different group of people and hosts them in her home, and they have dinner, and then they come to the show, and then they get together afterwards and talk over dessert about the play and about the issues in the play. And that is that's also a way of building community. And our board, as well as the artists, are really dedicated to that process. Also, I think many of them articulate that's why they want to help this particular organization.
Yeah, and that's the other part of this. We talk a lot about any individual can make theatre in the right circumstances, but we also talk a lot about that theatre doesn't exist if it doesn't have both the artist and the audience. And so that community is built every time a curtain rises, or every time some students in a class share their work with other students in their class. And that conversation, that dialogue between the artist and audience, I think is also central to the work that we're doing, and that we want to explore how to do that better as well. Thinking a lot about who the artists are on our stage and who the audience is, and who we are reaching and who we aren't reaching. Who do we really serve? Feels challenging, but I also think it's our responsibility to do that.
It also makes me think about the students who are involved in youth rep repeatedly, and who have maybe gone on and then come back in some way, and maybe come back with different perspectives or the same perspective, or how do they carry their perspective as an artist who performed on our stage into the community. Hannah, of course, came to mind because she talked, having been in youth rep and now as a teacher. I mean, it's quite literal, but there's more to it than that. It's pretty profound.
Yeah, I've been talking with a number of them. It's really extraordinary to me how many of our alumni go into either professional performing arts in some way, or education. Very dedicated teachers. So yeah, so they carry that, but often they talk about, it was the sense of community, the sense of family. That's what they loved about being part of New Hampshire Theatre Project, and that's what they try to carry forward into their lives now. It was interesting. I was talking with Ben Bacco via Zoom, who's in New York City, and he was talking about that one of the things he misses the most in this whole COVID-19 situation is that ability to build community. And he was in a play that they did it all on Zoom, and how that was interesting, because in actuality they built a community online, having never met each other in person. So I think the alumni carry that forward with them in whatever work they're doing. Yeah,
and that thinking about the current situation and the fact that we are even having this conversation through a computer, outside of this situation, we would have been sitting around a table on the stage having a staff meeting or a strategic meeting to talk about these issues and what's next for us. And that feels challenging. And how do we meet our community in the current moment if we can't gather them in our space? If we are an organization that fosters community, supports a community, helps build a community, how do we do that now? What are we doing to make sure that we can keep doing that. I think about We Don't Know What This Is Yet, and the piece of theatre that we are making in the current moment, choosing to invest in artists and choosing to invest in theatre making right now in order to support a very broad community. And only through that process will we start to see where our work really lies. And what we're doing right now is going out with that statement of we don't know what this is yet, but we're here. We know what we do. We know we're experts in communication. We know we're experts in difficult conversations, in tension, in conflict, and in resolution as well, and in how people interact. So we've put faith in that in order to support community. But will that be enough? Will that be enough for the current moment is something I think about a lot.
Well, I'm gonna say we know about resolution, and that's always nice and cathartic, but as Brecht would say, there is a great space for non-resolution, and I think that's where we're playing a role right now. For We Don't Know What This Is Yet, simply interviewing people, being witnesses to this moment in time, and then beginning to make connections. I mean, we've talked about the next step with that for us is that we want to look to all of our community partners that we've had over the past few years and start working with them to make connections. And I think that is another gift of theater, is that idea of working, well, really all the arts, of working towards something and you don't know what's happening. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a painter, and he was telling me, it starts like this amorphous mess, and the trick is to just keep working through, and he was showing me 20 pictures of this painting in different stages, and that is the piece that New Hampshire Theatre Project is dedicated to. Maybe we never get to an end product, and that moment, I mean, theater exists in this present moment, and then it moves on. We never get the final product. I mean, we might be able to film it. So to me, that's one of the things I think that we can offer right now. I don't know how. We're struggling to figure out doing things like this, having conversations on Zoom, thinking about, are there ways we can use our space that are not necessarily theater, but really that's our gift, is to be able to be comfortable in this space of what is happening right now. It's there are moments when it's beautiful and stunning, this pause, and there are moments of horror and pain and terror, and some of the things that are happening right now are really probably the lowest, the darkest that our nation has been in a long time, and existing in both of those places, that's hard. But that's part of what we can do, I think, to help people.
I can't remember who said it the other, I think we were in a We Don't Know What This Is Yet meeting, and we were talking about the fact that to remain present and listening and bearing witness and sitting with the uncertainty is the work of the moment, and that it can, as you just said, it can be very beautiful. It can also be incredibly difficult and painful, and that's a place where we need to be right now.
Yeah, and as actors and theatre makers train to hold any one of those emotions and the complexities of those emotions, when we feel pain and then we feel like a guilt at the same time, if we think about what, if I, to speak from my own perspective, might feel as a white individual in this country as we see police brutality against individuals of color, I can feel pain, but I have to understand that it's my version of pain, and then that can be wrapped up in guilt or shame, or even a sense of knowing that it is at a distance from me and I will not feel the same pain as another individual. maybe there's something to hold on to in our theatre training that helps us come to terms with that, acknowledge that, respect that, interrogate it, inquire about it, ask questions about it, look at it from all perspectives, and then take some of that learning or understanding and speak to more people and more people and more people. That becomes a very different conversation if we are talking to or working with the artists that we work with who are individuals of colour. But it also becomes a different conversation as we think about how do we work with isolated individuals over the age of 65? How do we work with teenagers? How do we work with how do we work? I don't mean to laugh at that, Jen, sorry.
Okay.
How do we work with individuals in recovery or those who have mental health challenges? Any of the populations that we have worked with or will work with in the future. I think a lot, again, back to that word empathy, and maybe I'm also thinking about this because of the conversation you said about how I facilitate, Jen, that again, the individual in the space is the expert in their experience, and we will not speak for them, but we will do our work to be an advocate and an ally, and where appropriate to amplify that voice. In our recent community connectors about cultural gatekeeping, we talked a lot about how organisations like ourselves, who could be described as being predominantly white, can become paralysed if we are too scared to have the conversation, because we don't know how to move forward, we don't know how to do better, we don't know how to change the systems that uphold oppression. But coming away from that conversation about cultural gatekeeping, I realised that even if we don't know what the next step is, to think of the theatre metaphor, right? Like, our blocking has not been set. We don't know whether we're crossing downstage, right? But we can trust what we do know enough to rely on the community that not only we support, but that supports us as well.
I was very fortunate for many years to work within the disability community, arts education and disability. I worked in that beautiful intersection. And one of the things that we talked a great deal about was that paralysis that comes from not wanting to do or say the wrong thing. And instead there would be complete inaction. And we talked a lot with cultural institutions, for example, who wanted to make their facilities both more physically accessible as well as their programming be more accessible to a broad range of people with disabilities. And just because you're programming for someone who is blind encompasses one piece doesn't necessarily mean it will apply. And there's a broad range there. And what we realized was that we needed to constantly listen, continually be present, make mistakes. It was inevitable, and we were careful to acknowledge and learn from it and move forward. And it was really hard sometimes. Some of the mistakes we made were, pretty significant, but you can't stop. You have to keep going.
That also comes back to the theatre training. I just can't help but think about that right now, because when we're working predominantly with much younger, actors and performers in training, right? Like, they might be the 7 or 8-year-olds who are for the very first time inhabiting a character and playing a role. We talk about the moments where a mistake happens, and it's carry on, keep going. The audience might never know. Now, in this moment, we don't necessarily want to, move on without acknowledging sometimes, but you've got to finish the story. Your fellow performers are waiting on that stage, like they're there willing you on, supporting you. They need you, and you need them to get over the stage fright, to remember that line, to remember to pick up that glass of water, because it's integral to the narrative, you know. But that we don't just throw up our hands and say, I don't know, and storm off the stage.
And there's a collective purpose there. And, you know, that collective purpose acts as a cohesive piece to it and allows for, you know, that moment of making a mistake and carrying on, because there's a bigger picture. It's bigger than any one individual on the stage. There's a much bigger end game there, and everyone, you know, has agreed by entering the stage.
Well, and I think in all art, I mean, mistakes are gifts that can be mined for so much else.
Happy accidents.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as we wrap up our conversation here, what are not the final thoughts, because again, it's the next part in the work that we're doing, but what feels challenging to you right now in terms of New Hampshire Theatre Project and how it continues to use theatre to build community? What feels challenging, and what are you hopeful for?
Well, I would say, you know, just practically as the executive director and moving towards passing the torch on as well in the next few years. What I think is going to be very, very challenging is to be able to continue to create theater and to do our mission when we don't know when we'll be able to let people in our space, when the schools will open, when we'll be able to work with other communities, when actors will be able to come together. That's a challenge. It's a challenge financially, certainly, which is why we're, you know, here we are for New Hampshire Gives. But I also feel like this time is a gift of a pause. We're an organization in transition, and I mean, the three of us have been, along with our board and all of our artists and our community advisors, have been working on that for a while, and it's going to continue because New Hampshire Theatre Project operated for 30 years under my vision, and now it's time for it to, you know, as I say, it's old enough to can't even have insurance anymore. It needs to move out of the house. So that's, personally, I think I'm answering that from a personal point of view, but it's really for the entire organization. How will we recreate ourselves and our community as we move forward into this brand new world? And it's both really exciting and really terrifying. How about you, Janice?
There's hope in, we talked the other day at the Community Connectors when we revisited the Shipyard project about the invitation always being there, and that we reiterate that we're committed to representing the state and all its diversity in our work. And so having a moment to pause and relook at that and affirm our intentions and adjust how that logistically looks. I mean, it does give me hope in the weirdest way that we have this moment to pause while we're not actually on the stage, so to speak. And yes, that is absolutely terrifying because we don't really know when we're going to be able to do that. And I think that the needs of our community are shifting day to day. And staying on top of that requires a great deal of energy. And that's both exhausting and exhilarating in a very strange way. Gives me both hope and presents a challenge at the very same moment.
Yeah.
And Catherine?
I feel the challenge as well of in this rapidly changing world, or in this world where the elephants in the room are no longer hidden for the broad society. The cracks are really beginning to show and get bigger and be more present. Although that can be very powerful, knowing how to create transformation out of that is really challenging. Knowing the right step to take. I'm hopeful though, because I feel a great sense of community within New Hampshire Theatre Project right now. We have 20 plus company artists. We have a strong, dedicated board with 5 new board members. We have expanded staff.
6.
Yeah. Yes, 6. We got a new one. 6 new board members. But we also have our funders and supporters, whether those are individuals or organizations, coming to us and saying, the work you do is important. What do you need? And what we've turned around and said is, we need to listen to our community to know what we need, because it's not about what we need, it's about what they need.
Right.
And then we'll be able to say what we need in order to support them. And that takes time. It takes time to have those conversations. It takes time to build community. And so sometimes it's a case of saying, stay with us, be with us, because we're in this for a longer time. And that feels hopeful, because I do think our funders and supporters are giving us that time, or is giving us that grace to think. And I think collaboratively, as we've said in our strategic planning that included 35 of the New Hampshire Theatre Project family, representing all forms of people who interact with our organisation, coming together and thinking strategically about our impact, our programmes, and the space and the assets that we have. That was huge to do that recently. And so I'm hopeful, because the community is strong. And I think it's only with that strong foundation that we'll be able to grow more and do more. And more in the sense of deeper sometimes, not necessarily more in multitude. I want to say thank you to everybody for watching this conversation. If you have thoughts as well about how the arts build community, you can join the conversation on our Facebook page or on Instagram at NH Theatre Project. You can also follow the YouTube channel that you're watching this on right now. Subscribe and you will be given alerts to the following programs that are happening during NH Gives 2020. We have a variety of programs that you can participate in, explore and watch. You can find more of that at our website at nhtheatreproject.org. If you would like to support the work that we do, there will be a link on the screen that you can follow in order to give as part of our NH Gives 2020 campaign. Thank you so much for being part of our community.
Thank you.
Thank you.